Hi everyone, I just want to wish everyone a happy 14th day of the 10th month on the Hebrew calendar. And in this video I just want to explain why I believe the Hebrew calendar is what's important primarily. It's what's most important in regard to the prophecy in the book of Daniel, and why I believe this is still the Hebrew year 5777, and why I believe the number 7 is what's important. Okay, some time ago I made this video over here. I believe it was 4 parts. It was called Why I Believe the True Jubilee Year is 5777. This was back in September of 2016 when I made that video. And as you can see, it was 4 parts, but then I also made some other videos explaining why I believe the Jubilee year has to always be year 7, and the importance of the numbers 777 and the number 27. And then I talked about it again over here in these videos. Okay, what I had pointed out in those videos is that the important year has to be year 7, and as you can see, the Balfour Declaration was actually dated November 2nd, 1917. And if you convert that to the Hebrew calendar, you see that that would be the 17th of Heshvan, 5678. So it's coming up with year 8 on the Hebrew calendar, but at the time when I made the video, I wasn't really considering the fact that on the Hebrew calendar they changed the year in the 7th month when the calendar actually goes from Nisan 1 to Nisan 1, but the Jews celebrate the beginning of the year in the 7th month. And so I think that proves that it was actually still, according to God's calendar, it was still the Hebrew year 5677, which would be the Jubilee year. But what I had pointed out in those videos is that I believed that this was initiated, or it would have had to have been initiated in year 7, and so I did some research, and when I looked into it, I saw, sure enough, that that is when the Balfour Declaration was initiated. It was actually initiated, over here it says June and July. You see that there was a draft of the declaration dated July 18th, 1917. I had seen somewhere else where there was another draft, I believe it was in August, but as you can see here in this Wikipedia article, it was drafted in July of that year initially. And so if you change this to July 17th and you convert to the Hebrew, you see that it would be the year 77. So that would be the Jubilee year. But aside from that, the year lasts until Nisan 1 of the following year, so it really shouldn't have changed in November. It should have still been the Hebrew year 77. So according to God's calendar that's specified in the Bible and the Torah, it should have been Hebrew year 5677 that this occurred, and so this would be the Jubilee year. But what I wanted to point out is that the initial event did take place in the Hebrew year 77 and the Gregorian year 17. Now, another thing that's interesting that I just want to mention is that the war began in November of 1914. It says immediately following their declaration of war on the Ottoman Empire in November 1914, the British War Cabinet began to consider the future of Palestine. So you see that the war began in 1914, and incidentally, in on August 21st of that year, there was a total solar eclipse going through Europe in the same pattern that there was just recently a total solar eclipse going through the United States on August 21st just this year in 2017. And then you see that you had the total solar eclipse, and then you had World War I declared, and then it was in 1917 that the war ended, and you had the Balfour Declaration. So that was 3 years later, and that also fits the pattern of the Passover week that I've talked about, where Nisan 14th is when the veil was rent, but then the resurrection occurred on the 17th. And it was actually technically on the 18th that the resurrection occurred, because it was just before dawn, Sunday morning, and that would have been the 18th. Okay, and I'll just go ahead and show it to you how Jesus was crucified on Nisan 14th. This is when the veil was rent, and then 72 hours later, it would have been, actually he was placed in the tomb just before dawn Thursday morning, just before it began to dawn on the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He was placed in the tomb, and the tomb was sealed that morning, and he was in the tomb for 72 hours. So that was 3 days and 3 nights. And then he rose just before dawn Sunday morning, which would have been the 18th. And I've shown how this fits the blood moon pattern, where the perfect lamb is chosen on the 9th and the 10th, and then it's inspected for 4 days, and then it's the lamb is slain on the 14th day of the month, and then Jesus was crucified on the 14th of Nisan, and then the resurrection occurred 72 hours later, just before dawn on Sunday morning. And so that would bring you to about here, which is actually where we are right now, January of 2018, based on the blood moon pattern. Okay, and we just had a super moon on January 1st, which I believe was also an eclipse. Okay, apparently the eclipse is on January 31st, and also we're at this point right here. I was looking at the wrong J, so this would be just before dawn, Sunday morning, and so this would be where 2018 starts, right here. And so there's an eclipse right here, which would be the one that occurs on January 31st, which would be the second of, or actually the third of 3 supermoons. And it's also a blue moon, which means it's the second full moon in a month, which could be an indication that there needs to be an intercalary month added. But this one is an eclipse, as well as a blue moon and a supermoon that's coming up on January 31st. But the largest of the 3 consecutive supermoons would be the one that just occurred on January 1st and 2nd. And you can see that right here. It says tonight's full moon is the second in a series of 3 successive full moon supermoons occurring on December 3rd, 2017, plus January 2nd and 31st, 2018. As is typically the case, the second of these 3 full moon supermoons most closely coincides with lunar perigee, showcasing the closest and largest supermoon in this grand procession of supermoons. And so this was the closest one and the largest one, but then the one on the 31st will be an eclipse as well as a blue moon. Okay, so you have this series of blood red moons spanning over the year 2018. You had a series of 3 spanning over the year 2011, and then right in the middle of that you had 2014, 2015, and as I've stated before, this seems to resemble the Passover week pattern. Okay, so the other thing, the important thing that happened that was in a year 7, of course, was the United Nations partition plan for Palestine, which was Resolution 181. And as you can see, that happened on the 29th of November, 1947. And when you convert that to the Hebrew calendar, you see that that's 5708 based on the way they're currently doing the calendar. But again, that's because they changed the year in the 7th month rather than the 1st month, which would be Nisan 1. But I had shown how in spite of that, the decision was based on a special committee. It says over here, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine issues its report, which recommends unanimously all 11 member states voting in favor that Great Britain terminate their mandate for Palestine and grant it independence at the earliest possible date, which also recommends by majority vote, 7 of the member nations voting in favor, that Palestine be partitioned into Jewish and Arab states. So the decision was made in August 31st, and so that would be the 15th of Elul, 5707. So the decision was made in the Hebrew year 5707, and it should have still been 5707 when the decree was passed, but because of the fact that they changed the calendar in the 7th month, it was technically 5708, but according to God's calendar, it should have still been the Hebrew year 5707. Okay, so now I want to show you why, if something were to happen in this Hebrew year 5777, which would have began on Nisan 1, why the year that matches it most closely would be the year 2017, because Nisan 1 began in March of 2017, and so you would have had all of April, so that would be 1 month, and then May would be 2 months, June would be 3 months, July would be 4 months, August would be 5 months, September would be 6 months, October would be 7 months, November would be 8 months, and December would be 9 months. Okay, so that would be 9 months that overlap the year, the Hebrew year 5777 would be overlapped by the year, the Gregorian year 2017. So if God wanted to represent the Hebrew year 5777 in terms of the Gregorian year, then the most accurate and most honest representation of the year that correlates with that year on the Gregorian calendar would be the year 2017. So if anything were to happen in the Hebrew year, what's left of the Hebrew year 5777, which lasts until March 17th, that would be the 1st of Nisan, then the most accurate representation in terms of the Hebrew, or in terms of the Gregorian calendar, would be the year 2017. And in addition to that, as I stated in my last video, there was no year 0, so this is technically the year 2017 anyway. So this would be the most accurate representation if anything were to happen in this Hebrew year 5777. And there is something that did happen to initiate something else happening, and that was the declaration by Trump, which also solidified this as the Jubilee year. So I just wanted to point that out. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.